Well, welcome to the Rice Report, everybody. Our interview series here today. We are being joined by an actual journalist. We live in an era where journalism has become nothing more than a clown show, reiterating centralized messages to be able to control the masses. And very rarely do you actually find someone challenging that status quo in journalism. And most commonly, you find these folks not associated with a big name in journalism itself. So I'd like to welcome in Patrick Henningsen to the show, who has been really instrumental in learning about what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Ukraine, following the tides that are turning around the world and some of the confusion that exists. One of the things I found most fascinating in the past few weeks is explaining how geopolitics actually work to people, where you have organized enemies that are designed to create conflict so that countries around the world spend money to kill others to enrich themselves. And Patrick has really been at the forefront of this entire model all along for years and years. There's a lot of people that follow him, big Twitter account. I highly advise you follow him on Twitter. Not only does he have good information to share, he also shares good information, which is a talent most people don't look for. Sharing information is very important to get it out there. So please welcome Patrick Henningsen to the show. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're overseas right now, right?
Yes, yes. I'm in Europe at the present time.
Great, great. What's it like out there right now? I always ask everyone.
Cold and wet and
Cold
gray.
and wet. So if you can, maybe give us just a little bit of background to the listeners out there, how you came to this, where you are in life right now, because I know you've been through tremendous challenges along the way, as everyone who tells the truth has. But I think I would really love to hear your story.
Well, briefly, I'm not a trained journalist in the academic sense, so I kind of picked it up on the street, you could say. So I started blogging in 2005, 2006, and with the Iraq War, and I was very much in the anti-war kind of movement and so forth with the Iraq War and post 9/11. I was getting interested in 9/11, doing a lot of research into that, as well as the Palestinian issue, which I was very actively engaged in the late 90s through till now even. So that was kind of my baptism into some of these geopolitical issues and trying to find my way politically, between the left and the right paradigm. As you're in your 20s and 30s,
Mhm.
it's often a quite a journey, and you change your political worldview gets changed quite a lot, and certainly that was the case with me. So, but I started 21st Century Wire as a blog in 2009, and I was very much full time debunking the whole climate change sort of narrative. And I even went to the COP21 in Copenhagen. That was Obama's big climate summit, and it turned out to be a total failure for America, for the globalists, and the whole agenda. It really got defeated badly there, and I was there to witness that. And so that was one of the first big stories I kind of reported on as a journalist. And from there, I just got more active. And after subsequent trips to the Middle East, to Lebanon, and to the Gulf, and so forth, I got a lot more knowledge on the ground and understanding in the post-war Lebanon sort of situation there. That was a great education, learning about the Middle East, and having lived in the Middle East multiple times, I've developed a little bit of a knowledge of how politics works and U.S. foreign policy, and different tribes and sects and countries and so forth, and so that really helped me to prepared me to really understand the Syrian conflict a lot better, and to understand what the Arab Spring really was in 2011, and with that geopolitical kind of acumen, and also just being able to ask questions. That was being called a conspiracy theorist at the time. So, and
Of course.
if you didn't accept the mainstream line, you're automatically a conspiracy theorist. But as we know, the conspiracy theorists have been right about most things and continue to be right about so many things. Not right about everything,
Of
but
course.
certainly on some of these big important issues, this type of thinking is no longer fringe. So questioning the mainstream narrative, questioning government claims, calling out things like chemical weapons attacks as possible false flags or outright hoaxes by Western or Israeli intelligence. In the case of Syria, for instance, that's not out of the bounds of discussion anymore, because the evidence has come in to show that that's actually what happened.
It's overwhelming. The
Yeah,
evidence has come in as literally overwhelming. It's almost logical at this point. If you're still believing that Assad gassed his own people,
mm,
you're definitely living in the narrative. So going back to Palestine, so you've been involved in the Palestinian movement since 1999 or late 1990s, you said?
Late 90s, yeah, and really just out of personal interest because of my, my neighbors and friends were Palestinian in London, so they were going through a lot of trauma after the Second Intifada, and people getting killed, and a lot of funerals and stuff like that. So that sort of issue kind of made its way to the streets of London politically as well, and I started getting more education, and I went to lectures from people like Edward Said, the famous Palestinian academic writer, and just gradually got a much better education on the issue. And that also helped to question my idea of what Israel was, because as an American, as you well know, you go through the American public school system, and support for Israel, for me anyway, in New England, the Boston area, was drilled into us quite heavily, probably from the age of 10. That's when it began. So we had to learn kibbutz songs in the choir. That was the first thing we did. And then when we junior high, we spent my whole 8th grade year, half the year was on Anne Frank's diary and the Holocaust, in
Of course.
history and English. So that was really a big part of your kind of curriculum is Israel and the Holocaust and so forth. And during Christmas, we would celebrate Hanukkah at school as well as Christmas. So we had to make menorahs in class and things like that. And so it was that whole, this is why American and Israeli interests are so interwoven. And if you add the Vatican II kind of transformation of the Catholic doctrine that placed Israel and the concept of Judeo-Christian shared,
Complete
religious,
contradiction
yeah,
in
it's
all
kind of
definitions. Yeah.
it's kind of contrived, but you can see the confluence of all these things, plus the emergence of the Israeli lobby in the 1960s, and to the powerful organization institution that it is now. You know, United States and Israel are so joined at the hip,
Yeah.
and to break free of that outside of the media matrix in America is really difficult. The first thing, you have to get out of that matrix physically.
Mhm.
And if you're able to do that, and then you start traveling, then I think you have a chance to kind of break through a lot of these sort of stereotypes. But I know, having said that, I know a lot of Americans that have managed to break out of this matrix in the United States.
You're talking to one.
Yeah, and young too, and
Yes.
more after October 7th with all the student protests and stuff like that. These kids are so well versed on history, and they could just rattle off the dates of and why the Oslo Agreement failed, and all these other, and debunk a lot of the lies that
Mhm.
are a big part of the Israeli lobby's Hasbara information campaign. So that's interesting, because this wasn't always the case. Now it's been very mainstreamed, the kind of questioning Israel, Zionism, and really recognizing the plight of the Palestinian people as a universal human rights issue.
Well,
Not, not, yeah.
that's a good place to go. Is you have the intersection of America and Palestine, and the theory is, because I tell people all the time what's really happening with Israel. I mean, people don't look at simple facts, like the CIA was created in 1947. A year later, Israel was created, and somewhere along the way, many mail bombs were dropped off at our own president's White House to influence his decision to make Israel an actual nation state.
Are you talking about Harry Truman?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah. There
and
was pressure on definitely some pressure on Truman. Yeah.
so in America, we have this, America is really good at gang warfare, right? America has become, you're either black, you're white, you're either blue, you're red, you're Democrat, Republican. There's no in between. And the Palestine-Israel conflict is really one of the things waking people up, because you can be pro-Palestinian, or you could be anti-Israel. It doesn't mean you're one or the other.
Mm.
I am pro-freedom and I am pro-truth, and that is one of the reasons I won't say I stand with Palestine, because I've never been there, but I certainly stand for the people of Palestine, a nation that has no military, no navy, no Marines, no army, no official really governance around a military complex, and they're being bombed by one of the strongest militaries in the world relentlessly. So, can you walk us through? If you're in America, someone would say, well, hey, you stood with Palestine, you must be a Democrat, right? You must be a Democrat. You must be a pro-jihadist. Walk us through kind of that confluence of free thinking versus the American paradigm. I think it's something that many people need to understand.
Well, I mean, I think the most important thing off the top is just, in the last 14 months post October 7th, a lot of Americans and people in the West who, let's say they haven't really red pilled on geopolitics. So for them, this is a new issue,
Mhm.
especially younger people that are coming of age. They've never been confronted with this issue in the Middle East. Now, if you're older, or people like our age or older, they've been litigating this issue for, decades,
Mhm.
decades. It's been a thing. And, it's for me, looking back in my student days through the 90s and then attending, conferences and talks and lectures. I've been to before the internet, I used to go to lectures. It's like so
You're giving away your age, Patrick. You're
I
giving it
know,
away,
I
man.
know. I used to go to talks, lectures, and film screenings, so it was a really bizarre world back then. But when you go to these things, you always find the South African apartheid movement or the anti-apartheid movement was always there with the Palestinians. And I always tell people this when I'm talking about this issue. So these have always been married together. They've always been synonymous. Nelson Mandela himself has been campaigning for the Palestinians ever since he was, freed from Robben Island. He's been very public, very specific about about the Israeli occupation and so forth. So, and that not only with South Africa, but other countries as well. So all around the world. So, and it traditionally, this is aligned with socialist countries or the non-aligned movement, as the NAM movement, as it was called. Not all socialist countries, but mostly. And so this has always been at loggerheads with the United States and their allies geopolitically. These are all like independent states or parties within states that can't be bought
Mhm.
and are now sanctioned, most of them. So that used to be the old non-aligned movement. And Palestinians had a great international network, a political network, which was through the PLO. So
Mhm.
they had, Palestinian communities. You'd find them in Tokyo, you'd find them in Beijing, you'd find them in America, in Texas, in Mexico. They're everywhere. Just like the Lebanese, if you travel around the world, there's a Lebanese enclave in almost every country you can possibly imagine. It's a very
But
small country,
but
Lebanon.
don't do it in America because you'll be fired as the head coach of the New York Jets. Don't
Oh,
put a
right.
Lebanese flag on your shirt because you will be fired the next day.
I know how offensive the cedar tree with the red
Right.
stripes. I mean, it's like practically a Christmas card. But so anyway, I'm just kind of framing that issue a little bit, and then how it was, I think, disingenuously framed at October 7th, 14 months ago in 2023, was that anybody supporting the Palestinians who were being carpet bombed
Mhm.
and slaughtered on an industrial scale, that somehow these were pro Hamas ergo, they're pro terrorist
Correct.
demonstrations on US campuses. We're talking about America specifically.
Which, if you
And
follow the money trail that goes to Hamas from Israel, actually makes you pro-Israel. If you're pro-Hamas based on a money trail of $1.3 billion the previous year, most people don't realize that money trail leads directly from Hamas back to Israel.
well, yeah, I mean, that's a separate discussion, but
Yeah.
Hamas was effectively created by Shin Bet, Israeli intelligence, because they really wanted a counterweight extremist party to neutralize the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, and really it's kind of a divide and conquer strategy. What happened was Hamas started growing in popularity, and then they became even more, let's say, militant in terms of taking up arms against Israel, more anti-Zionist in their positions and in Gaza. And then Israel kept going with that because they're like, well, this is great. We have these extremists. We can eventually use this as
Mhm.
an excuse to kill more Palestinians and to annex more land. And that's exactly what they did. And then there's a little bit of a story between then and Ariel Sharon's tenure in charge and where we have now with Netanyahu. But suffice to say, you'll find this is a common theme in colonialism is the creation of controlled opposition, and
Yes.
that's what they tried to do with Hamas. So Hamas wouldn't exist if there was no Israeli illegal occupation in Palestine, pure and simple. Likewise, and Israel actually paid for Hamas.
Mhm.
Likewise, Hezbollah would not exist without the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon, which they went to take territory in Lebanon to create a security buffer zone during the Lebanese Civil War and then created all sorts of problems. They pushed Palestinians into Lebanon and then claimed that those Palestinians were a security threat to Israel, so they invaded Lebanon. So, at the center of all these problems, of course, is Israel. There
Yes.
would be no Hezbollah. It wouldn't exist. It wouldn't exist if Israel had not invaded Lebanon. So try to explain that to an American, and boom, their brain shuts off pretty quickly, generally, because it becomes more complicated. And then the history in the Middle East is very complex and multi-layered. And once you start getting into it, it's like a lattice. I mean, it just takes we could spend days basically talking about aspects of this. In fact, we posted a lecture by Roy Casagrande, who's a professor
Yeah.
from Austin, Texas, great historian, with Stream of Consciousness 2-hour talk, which is his style. And you could just sit there and he could just go on about the Crusades or one crusade. But if you want to put the establishment of the state of Israel into a broader perspective historically, think of it as the 10th crusade. The 10th crusade, because there is versions of Zionism before, during the previous Christian crusades.
Hmm.
Same thing. And it was to secure the Silk Road for European elites and for European oligarch interests. That's what the crusades originally were for. There was a spiritual component to it as well in terms of Christianity, but this kind of evangelical, more sort of expeditionary version of Christianity, which
Schofield version. Yes.
yeah, and coincided with
Yeah.
the beginnings of colonization, it kind of made sense. And likewise, the discovery of oil in the Middle East in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and then the need to secure this fuel after the First World War for the great powers, gave another reason why the West, specifically the British at the time, but also the United States, needed a beachhead in the Middle East that served their interests, that was very friendly for them, and that they could use as a conduit for two things. One is to have that beachhead as a base of operations at the heart of the Silk Road, but a very important religious crossroads of Jerusalem
Mm.
historically. So the geopolitics and the religion are intertwined for sure. But there's another aspect of it, which is it became the raison d'etre for the United States when they took over the Middle East from the British after the Suez Crisis in the late 1950s, was to permanently destabilize the Middle East, not the whole Middle East. The Gulf monarchs were taken care of. They have privileged caste status and lots of money. So that was fine. The British, the Americans, the French to a lesser degree, they were able to manage affairs and manage oil and resources through these monarchs
Mm.
of emirates that they created. They chose ultimately who the blessed families would be, and that they named their countries after. But then once oil became globalized, it wasn't so much a need for the control of petroleum. I mean, controlling the price is important with OPEC,
Hmm.
and having those Saudi dollars going into New York banks is very important for the United
Huge. Yeah.
States. Yeah,
Huge.
sovereign debt, Citibank, and all these institutions, many of them wouldn't exist without Saudi Arabia as powerful financial institutions because of the petrodollar. So it does play an important role in the global economy, these oil producing emirates. But here's what you need to understand. If you go back to U.S. foreign policy, and I talk about this a lot, and I put this out there because people need to study this. It's very important, because you can't understand what's going on today strictly by even Israeli interests and Israeli manipulation of the U.S. government. Is a bigger agenda. Okay, during
Mm.
the Cold War, all of the U.S. decisions, including overthrowing the government of Iran in 1953. The United States and the British overthrew the first democratically elected government in Iran of Mohammad Mossadegh in 53. Now, the reason for that was the resurgence and rising of the Communist Party, the Tudeh Party in Iran. They believed that if Mossadegh nationalized the oil, which would cut out British petroleum
Mm.
from this very good, high quality fuel source that they needed to secure. And then the Soviet influence would move in. And if they became more socialist, that would be a disaster, because that would give the Soviet Union another path to the sea. and then also another great source of fuel and geopolitical leverage. So that had to happen. But everything else wasn't because of communism per se. This is always a concern for the US during the Cold War. But the thing that they feared more, and if you go back to look at Dwight D. Eisenhower's foreign policy till today, it's always been Arab nationalism and
Hmm.
pan-Arabism. And this is what Israel also feared, because you couldn't buy off and control Arab nationalist countries as easily. They're more sovereign, they tend to be more independent, and they tend to want to merge together with other Arab countries, because after all of the problems we're seeing today, many of them are a result of the post-World War I map-making exercise of the Sykes-Picot Agreement that
Hmm.
split up Greater Syria, for starters. So Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, one country after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Kingdom of Syria, Greater Syria. So when there was no Israel.
Right.
So that was all broken up and then destabilized with the British Mandate, then the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And that's when things started unraveling in terms of stability in the region. And of course, you mentioned the CIA. The first government the CIA ever overthrew or attempted to overthrow was in 1949, and it was Syria. So a
Mm.
little bit of a trivia that a lot of people aren't aware of. And the United States has tried to overthrow the government of Syria probably a dozen times since then, right up until the current. What we're seeing right now is a yet another attempt to overthrow the government of Syria. So Arab nationalism, pan-Arabism, the merger of Syria and Iraq, or these countries, keeping them divided and at each other's throats, and competition for resources, and always playing on divisions between tribal affiliations, sects like Shiite, Sunni, Christian, and of course Jewish Zionism, is the recipe for instability in the region, for the areas that matter, okay,
Right.
that aren't emirates. So that's an important, I think, feature to understand. From there, you can kind of have a better understanding of what's driving this. And right now, the most important concern for the United States is the security of Israel. Every single US position in the Middle East is strategically positioned to able to defend Israel. And we saw that. It's been proven twice in the last year. Once
Yes.
in April and again in October, when the Iranian missiles came. It activated all of the US batteries and positions in Jordan, Iraq, northeastern Syria, illegal occupation of Syria by the US for the
Hmm.
last 7 years, the Red Sea, the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, all of Qatar, all of these things locked in, Mediterranean positions, Cyprus.
Hmm.
Okay, so that envelope is what Israel requires to protect itself, to allow it to run an apartheid state, to conduct genocide, and to declare war and maintain wars against all of its neighbors simultaneously. It requires that massive U.S. security envelope.
Oh, sure. It's like the little dog that'll bark at any other dog because the big dog's standing behind it ready to defend. So that
Yep.
little dog's going to go out and bite anything it possibly can in order to gain ground so that the big dog, if he's activated, the everyone else flees. Now, can you explain this is fascinating, Patrick, by the way, because this conversation is leading into areas of history that no one understands. We're going to get into current events in just a moment because I don't think anyone in this country has any clue what's happening in Syria. But before we do that, you mentioned a genocide. So this is a triggering word for Americans when they hear that a genocide is being conducted in multiple nations. We have Palestine, which is well known. It's even an international court crime. But Lebanon's no different. One of the things I try to bring to people, and I haven't been there, so I'm just going off what I've read. There is a massive Christian population in Palestine as well as Lebanon. Lebanon's 40% Christian, and they are bombing those regions to no end, which, again, in the beginning, when I said Judeo Christian is a contradiction, it's an oxymoron. That term only exists in America. Only American do they express Judeo Christian. Now, parts of Ireland, you'll have that with Protestants who are evangelical. You'll have parts throughout Europe that believe that. Predominantly, it's American. So when you say genocide, someone watching this show who may be an evangelical who's already disagreeing with everything that you've said, they're going to be triggered by that word because their retort is going to be, Patrick, it's not a genocide. They're killing the terrorists. Can you break that apart for us and let us understand the difference between going after terrorists versus committing a genocide? I think it's a
Well,
great topic to cover.
It's just common sense. It's just common sense. So if you can see, it's all based on standing up propaganda constructs, basically, for a Western audience. Look at look at what we've witnessed. It's the first time in history. When you file a case for genocide, and the United States is a signatory to the Genocide Convention, and the stipulation, the qualifications are very specific. And it's always been a big challenge to get the evidence after the fact by
Hmm.
interviewing witnesses, doing forensic examinations, tabulating body counts, and things like that, cross referencing records, all sorts of things. It's very, very tricky to prove a mass killing, let alone a genocide. And this, according to the International Courts of Justice, has been the easiest case they've ever had to prosecute because all of the evidence was live streamed and posted. A lot of it was posted by Israeli soldiers on TikTok and
Hmm.
social media. So they sort of shot themselves in the foot by kind of aggrandizing and boasting about blowing up schools, picking off children with snipers, blowing up hospitals, torture.
18-year-old Christian churches, 1800-year-old churches.
Sure, some of the oldest historic Christian churches in the world. And because it's a big shocker for a lot of American people who identify as Christian,
Mm.
to say that actually the birthplace of Christianity is actually in Palestine.
Correct.
It's not Israel. So Israel, for all intents and purposes, didn't exist back then. So it was Palestine. And Jesus was Palestinian. He
Correct.
spoke Aramaic. He spoke Aramaic, and so to tell Americans that, they get kind of flustered. They're like, "Oh, what do you mean?" So Israel has made life hell for Christians in Palestine, and what's happened in Israel, in Syria, and Lebanon with the Lebanese civil war that was driven largely by Israel, it drove a lot of Christians out of the country, and they went to the United States, to Dearborn, Michigan, to Los Angeles, to Sydney, Australia, to everywhere around the world, Brazil, Mexico City, Canada, Toronto. Millions of Christians left Lebanon, or hundreds of thousands now with families, now millions, the diaspora. And the same thing happened in Iraq with the Iraq War. Very key historic Christian population was driven out by the United States, the war that the US started in Iraq.
Hmm.
They weren't persecuted under Saddam Hussein. They weren't the sectarian strife as we
They
know
were
it to
employed under Saddam Hussein. He
the,
employed many Christians.
true, and to high ministerial positions. So
Hmm.
to and I could talk more about that because I've also been to Iraq and met some of these groups.
Have you been to Mosul? That's the
Uh,
most interesting story to me in the world is Mosul, Nineveh, 2014
I could,
destruction.
yeah, I couldn't go there at the time when I was there because that area was roped off because I was there just as they had kind of defeated ISIS in some of the major battles, but there was still a risk that some of these cells were active at the time. I've been to Tikrit
Mhm.
and Kirkuk, not quite to Kirkuk, but just on that road, and then Samarra, and then Baghdad, and then to the south to Basra and so forth. So I've seen a little bit of Iraq, and then I've met Christian militias who fought
Mhm.
against ISIS. I met a Sunni militia group, Sunni, that fought against ISIS and won one of the more decisive battles in the ground war against ISIS, which the U.S. didn't really participate in. The U.S. didn't really fight ISIS in close combat. They just basically did a lot of air sorties,
Drone bombs, yeah.
flattened a few cities, killed tens of thousands of civilians in the process, and then declared victory, which is what it's done so many times. But when you meet the Iranians who died on the battlefield, or the comrades and the colleagues of the Iranians who died fighting ISIS, who the Mike Pompeo calls terrorists.
Yeah.
He calls the Iranians who fought and defeated ISIS terrorists, just like Qasem Soleimani, who was one of the great geniuses on the battlefield that helped to defeat ISIS. He was labeled as a terrorist and assassinated by Donald Trump.
Mhm.
Doesn't make any sense. They're fighting this
Walk through that. Yeah, walk through
well,
that. Soleimani and Trump is gonna be one of those topics somebody's gonna watch this who's a Trump supporter and go, "No, no, 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 no. He was the worst terrorist." You could argue both directions, and I'm not an expert, so please
well, look,
elaborate on that.
there is no the whole idea that Qasem Soleimani was a terrorist is really a great piece of U.S. and Israeli propaganda, and they had to demonize him and anybody like him because Israel just couldn't accept the fact that their proxies in the region, like ISIS acts as an instrument for Israeli
Oh,
interests.
they're a battering ram. They've never attacked Israel, and 3 different ISIS leaders have been uncovered to be Mossad agents. Like,
And many
this
times,
should be commonplace knowledge.
but not only that, many times Israel has acted as ISIS's air force
Mhm.
by striking Syrian army positions in Syria when battles were swinging one way or the other. All of a sudden, Israel comes in with airstrikes. So there wasn't.
Hmm.
It's not. ISIS is doing Israel's bidding on the ground by destabilizing, weakening Syria, and softening up for regime change. But also keeping the border between Iraq and Syria as unstable and not porous means that weapons and other goods can't transfer from Iran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon. You see,
Creating more control.
that's a key interest of Israel. So how do you close the border between Iraq and Syria? ISIS ISIS supplies that solution for them. And the US, of course, is very active in maintaining the ISIS presence right now today.
Mhm.
The US is illegally occupying, fact, and this hurts the feelings of some Americans because because they haven't heard it on Fox, they just assume that it's not happening.
Right.
Okay, but America's been illegally occupying a third of Syrian territory for 7 years, and then arming and paying Kurdish proxies as their sort of footmen in that operation. And one of the key U.S. bases is in a place called Al Tanf, which is right down at the juncture of the Iraq, Syria, and Jordanian border. Very key strategic place. And of course, as if by magic, this is also where some of the ISIS remnants are allowed to sort of exist, and they're sort of around. They have a
Hmm.
little prison that the Kurdish keep the ISIS fighters in, and at the opportune time, those prisons will be emptied and those fighters will be released because that's exactly what happened before the last wave of ISIS. It was called the Great Jihadi Jailbreak.
Mhm.
Very few people covered it or put together the 3 jailbreaks. We were one of those outlets, 21st Century Wire, but we saw a pattern of, major jailbreaks and so forth. And then they managed to
And they were
negotiate.
voluntary, right? These weren't actual jailbreaks. They just opened the doors, right?
No, 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 no. These were violent jailbreaks.
Oh, they
They
did overthrow and get out.
A lot of people were killed, guards and so forth. So I think there was one in Iraq. There was also a couple of others, and there's a similar thing happened in Syria, but that was the result of concessions made by the Syrian government as part of negotiations early on in the so-called Arab Spring. That's a separate discussion.
It's like a
But
4-hour discussion too, I'm sure. With
yeah,
your depth of knowledge, I'm sure we can go into that forever.
well, yeah, you can go into any of these crevices forever, but all you need to know is this. The heavy lifting against ISIS was done by Iraqi militias, Iranian militias, and they had a fatwa for the mobilization of the people. It's called the PMUs, People's Mobilization Units, in July of 2014 because the Iraqi government was overrun. One of the reasons why they're overrun because the U.S. withdrew a lot of key support for the Iraqi army right before ISIS appeared, and that must be a coincidence, right? That
Sure.
that the Abrams tanks divisions weren't able to do what they were supposed to do because technical support was pulled right before, or that the arsenals and stockades were run to zero right
Hmm.
before ISIS arrived. And so arms shipments didn't come and all this stuff. The Iraqi military is totally dependent on the United States, just like the Afghani security forces that were trained by the U.S. are totally dependent on the United States.
Hmm.
So as soon as the U.S. pulls out or stops supplying, they're finished. It's over. So those aren't really solutions that are very sustainable, but yet we see this time and time again. And so the Iraq raised its own out of their population 150,000 PMUs from different
Wow.
sects, mostly Shiite because that represents the country, but they had Yazidi, Christian, Fali, Kurds, they had Sunni, different PMUs. They're called the Hashd al-Shabi, and they absolutely turned the tide against ISIS, and they lost a lot of men. A lot of people died. A lot of Iraqis died. This is why you really need to give them credit because they spilt blood defending
Sure.
their country, and the U.S. charged the Iraqi government for air sorties.
Of course they did.
The bill per air sortie is probably a minimum of $50,000. And they
Wow.
threw thousands of air sorties. So a lot of Iraqi oil revenue went straight into the pockets of the United States. And in the same way that the U.S. military support for Saudi Arabia in the war against Yemen, which is another undeclared war of aggression from March 2015 for 9 years, that was also a business transaction, military arrangement with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But anyway, so the United States, the commander of those PMUs that defeated ISIS, his name was Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. And the U.S. declared him as a terrorist because he was part of the insurgency during the U.S. occupation of Iraq. And Qasem Soleimani was the head of the Quds Force. This is Iran's top expeditionary military force, and he was labeled a terrorist for the same reason. But between the two of them, they masterminded the defeat of ISIS, and Iraq took back all of its territory.
So you're saying that history will prove that someone who's a nationalist defending their own soil, their own people against foreign invaders is declared a terrorist. Imagine that, right?
Imagine that. And, give me liberty or give me death. Isn't
Right.
that what Patrick Henry said?
Our motto.
Uh,
And yet we hate it when other people do it.
and what are the Palestinians doing in Gaza? They're flying the Gadsden flag.
Yes.
They're flying the Gadsden flag. So as Americans, if we can't relate to that, because our whole national story is based on overthrowing the oppression of the British monarchy, which it
Mhm.
wasn't nearly as oppressive. It was over a tax on tea,
Mhm.
not having your whole family killed and your city carpet bombed and living under a apartheid Bantustan reservation system. I mean, the American colonies weren't living that in that sort of squalor as
Mhm.
subjects of the British Empire. America revolted for much less. And that's enshrined in the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, and all these things. All of these rights we have that we won, that we fought for, in what's a righteous cause in America, an anti-colonial revolution, an uprising by force of arms, and that's the national identity in America. But when other countries do this against America's modern imperial interests, they're labeled as terrorists
Every time.
every time. And then when they're labeled as terrorists, these are all established political movements who became armed liberation struggles. I'll list them off for you. There's many of them. One is Hezbollah, again, created because of the Israeli occupation. Hamas is another one, created by Israel, an armed liberation movement. The PLO, same thing, illegal occupation, according to the United Nations and dozens of UN Security Council resolutions. Ansar Allah in Yemen
Mhm.
is now that what they call the Houthis, the sort of power that they're able to project would not have been possible without the U.S. and Saudi Arabia's war that some international organizations called a genocide against Yemen. They're labeled terrorist. And the list of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, is labeled a terrorist organization. So, and the list goes on and on. So the Hashid probably is now in Iraq by now. I'm not sure. Hezbollah is, of course. So by doing that, by labeling national armed liberation struggles or national defense militias, which is what Hezbollah is. It's a national defense militia for South Lebanon. Why? Why do they need it? Because the United States dictates that the Lebanese National Army cannot have air defense, cannot have any big heavy equipment, cannot have any planes.
Hmm.
They only have one or two Russian MiGs, which don't really fly. They were given as a gift from the Soviet Union or from Russia.
So why would they dictate that?
So
What?
because Israel has said to the U.S., tell Lebanon they cannot have X, Y, and Z to defend themselves, because Israel reserves the right to use Lebanese airspace to mount regular monthly airstrikes against Syria for the last 10 years.
So Patrick, you're going to shock everyone. So you're telling me Israel controls America in many different facets.
Oh, many different facets.
Yeah.
The whole of the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is a product Go look at the Clean Break document from the mid 1990s, the
Yep.
Project for the New American Century. That's all come out of the Israeli lobby, chapter and verse. Netanyahu himself is the architect of U.S. Middle East foreign policy.
Which is
100%
ironic because he's not actually Israeli. He's Polish.
Polish American.
Yeah.
But he wrote a book basically in the 80s that he was touting around to make himself like the security expert of his time, that the United States needed to overthrow all of these governments in the Middle East. And then he was, I think, the chief lobbyist to get the US to engage in the 2003 Iraq war. He was the driving force.
Oh, yeah. He guaranteed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction in front of Congress. He guaranteed it.
And he
And we never
guaranteed
found anything. All we did find was 1.3 million dead Iraqis. What was it? Something like $292 billion within the first 6 months of the war. I mean, it was just a massive land grab, money grab, and a life grab.
well,
So, yeah, he guaranteed it.
the big con was that he sold it to the US Congress and Senate as that there would be peace and stability if you intervene and overthrow Saddam Hussein. This will create peace and stability in the region. All the other governments will topple very easily after that. 7 governments in, 7 years or something like that. The plan never came to fruition. They're still doing that plan today.
Yes.
We're still in the process of that plan now, but it is a huge failure. And then what you see with U.S. foreign policy, at least with the Middle East, and this goes from the 1950s till now. And in fact, I had a professor, I did my master's degree in international relations from a very good British university, University of Plymouth. But one of my professors, his thesis actually proved that each U.S. intervention in the Middle East was to fix and repair a mess from the previous intervention. And I think he had 7 or 8 cycles, and is very well documented, and he obviously did his doctorate on that basis.
So our foreign policy is kind of like the pharmaceutical industry, right? So we're going to give you a pill for this intervention, but it's going to cause another disease. That other disease is going to cause another pill, and we just continue to destroy.
You're missing the important mechanism there, which is, and we're going to make a lot of money doing it.
Of course. Of course.
And that's exactly like the pharmaceutical industry. In fact, if you want to reverse engineer this argument, the pharmaceutical industry is based on a military model.
Yes,
Actually.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
including flags.
And now we're, the false flag, we can go on for false flags in the Middle East on and on, because 90% of them are false flags. There are certainly real wars that occur there, and regional conflict. But when you look at like Palestine and Israel, that just general area of the world, I think people forget that the Jewish people didn't all of a sudden show up in Israel. They were always there. The Palestinians were always there. When national lines were drawn around 2 areas of land, creating new territory, and the state of Israel was created, again, 1 year after the CIA was created, that's when the conflict began. I don't think most people understand that Israel-Palestine was never an issue until the Zionist state of Israel was recreated in 1948 through the Balfour Declaration, led by Lord de Rothschild, which should absolutely trigger anyone who understands anything about the world. So in that region right now, we're looking at Lebanon is a travesty, by the way. I forget, as Ramisi, I forgot the name of the town. The town that they first invaded into Lebanon is 95% Christian, and it no longer exists.
Yeah.
That is completely, there's phosphorus bombs being dropped.
Sure.
And now it's
that's an Israeli objective, as well as is driving Christians out of the region. People say, "Oh, that's not fair to say that." I'm not into theories. I look at results, and the results of Israel's actions in the West Bank, in Bethlehem, they're encroaching and making life absolutely a nightmare in Bethlehem. There's land theft, property theft. So the Christian populations are being driven out. The Coptic Christians have been driven out of Egypt because of mysterious outbreak of terrorism. Isn't that interesting? So the Coptics driven out of Egypt, the Christians out of Palestine. Used to be a much higher Christian population in Palestine, much higher. Used to be 35%. Now it's down to 15%. Lebanon, same. It's really whittled down. Syria, same. ISIS has driven a large percentage of the Iraqi Christian population out of Iraq. And so why? Because for whatever reason, Christians on the socioeconomic scale, I'm making a generalization, but in some of these countries, slightly higher, maybe enough to afford to be able to leave in some cases, or link up with international family networks and so forth. So, and Muslims leave the region as well. But obviously we can talk about birth rates and things like that. So the net result is less Christians in the Middle East. And this suits Israel down to the ground, because the narrative they sell in America is that it's just Muslims, it's the Jews in Israel versus this Islamic horde that want to
Mhm.
push us into the Mediterranean. That's the basic narrative, and that sells well in most Republican circles, especially. This is what the Mike Pompeos of the world like to sell. This is what Netanyahu likes to sell to all the evangelicals in Congress and so forth. So this kind of goes well. And then the evangelicals in America that are end of times dispensationalists,
Mhm.
they see all of this as just great, because we're getting towards the end times. Let's accelerate this.
Yeah, it's
Let's
God's plan that they all die.
And Jesus is going to come back, and then what about all the Jews? What's going to happen to them? The evangelicals in Texas, in the Bible Belt, will say, well, they'll just look at you and they'll say, well, they're going to have to convert, aren't they? I've had that conversation with
Me
people.
too. Me
It's
too.
really freaky. And, no one's having that conversation in a political sense.
No.
So, according to American evangelical Christians, they throw the Jews under the bus before the end times. I mean, it's a convert or die, basically. I mean, so what
And
you
it's such an illogical proposition to begin with, because a Jew I'm saying derogatory, a Jewish person by itself is so I'm a Christian, I'm pro Christ, right? So we live in you're either pro Palestine, anti Palestine. So let's look at Jews and Christians. You're either pro Christ or anti Christ. And
well,
yet Christians still can't diagnose that. Like, the defiers of Christ are the ones, and they're saying we're going to protect them. They're God's chosen people. But at the end times, they either have to convert or die.
that's the evangelical narrative.
Correct.
If you actually go and you look at how Christians, Jews, and Muslims were living side by side
Peacefully.
simultaneously in Palestine, in Jerusalem, in Damascus, in other places, in Iraq, they didn't have that issue, because they didn't have
Right.
the crazy evangelicals in the Middle East. The further you get away from the birthplace of Christianity, the more crazy and insane and fundamentalist you get. The same, and this is when it gets really weird. ISIS, fundamentalist, extremist, Takfiri Islam, ISIS, they have an end of times doctrine, but
Mhm.
they just invert it, and they decide who's going to be the, what do you call it, the
The
antichrist.
Mahdi. Yeah.
So for them, Bashar al-Assad is the antichrist, and they have to march to the gates of Damascus, you see. So and then there's an end times eschatological narrative for Judaism as well. So you have three competing end time stories, and within Christianity, multiple end time stories, interpretations, okay?
Correct.
And you have Talmudic, you have Torah Jews, totally different. They're all
Totally
Jewish,
different.
totally different end times narratives. So the Torah, you'll find traditional Orthodox Jews are very much at odds with Zionism. And
Yes.
I've spoke to them. I have spent time with them and talked to them. They are the most wonderful people you could ever meet. They marched on against the Iraq War on the streets with
Yes.
everybody else. The rabbis came down and on Shabbat and marched for hours in the morning, because they couldn't take a taxi, or they did it the old-fashioned way. These are, older Orthodox Jews, wonderful people. So between the Christians, the Jewish sects, and the Islamic sects, there's all these competing end times narratives, and everybody is essentially undermining each other with,
Right.
if they really believe it. Then you have moderate Christians, moderate Jews, and Muslims who are very devout, who study the scripture, who are very serious about learning and the spiritual aspects of their faith, but they're not evangelical, they're not
Mhm.
expeditionary, they're not crusaders. And
Mhm.
what you have in America is a lot of crusaders still, and you have some in Europe as well. And what is the state of Israel but a colonial project? It's a European. Israel was created, as you said, by the Balfour Declaration, I think, which was signed around 1920, if I'm not mistaken, but
Yep.
didn't come into
1919. Yeah.
didn't come into fruition until later. But it was a European problem. So they took a European problem, which was that Europeans couldn't live with the Jewish population,
Hmm.
and it came to a head eventually with Hitler in the Second World War. But the immigration and the Zionist movement was conceived long before that. Hitler was totally in favor of this as well. He founded the
Hmm.
Anglo-Palestine Bank and transferring assets to the Holy Land so people could emigrate easier. Um,
Most people don't know that Hitler actually set up a military caravan, fully restored assets paid for by Germany.
they did it
To
by wire transfer. It was the first SWIFT system.
That's correct. That's
It was the
correct.
first SWIFT system.
And he
And
said, "Please go to Palestine. That's the land you won in the last war. Please
so
go."
so so again, it's a colonial project of white Europeans, and I'm not a flaming liberal here. I'm just telling it like it is. It's white Europeans creating a colonial enclave in the middle of an Arab population and enforcing that, and later at the barrel of a gun.
Yep.
And what do you think's going to happen? You think that's going to be all rosy? And when you displace a couple, 3/4 of a million local Arabs and say that you can't live here anymore and you can't come back, there's going to be problems.
Generational problems.
And that's what we're living with today. It's a failed European colonial project. It's a failed European solution to a European problem. Again, again. So and we're telling the local population, just deal with it. Just
Right.
deal with it. Do what we say, and if you don't, we're going to bomb you into kingdom come. And we can, because we're a more advanced society, and we're more righteous, and you're more barbaric, and Islam's an illegitimate faith according to the extreme right in Europe and America, and so forth. And so it's a lot of different. Islam is a cult. I don't know how many extremist Americans I've heard say this, and these are
Right.
real wacky people who have an issue. There's racism there, but I think it's also based on fear. I think, I'm not going to condemn Americans or Europeans or anybody. They're a product of the propaganda that has conditioned them to be
That's correct.
fearful. And that's what happened after 9/11. So these people might hold these views, they might have these views, but deep down, when you drill and you sit and you talk to them, so why do you feel that way about people in the Middle East? Why do you hate them so much? Why are they subhuman? And why don't you mind if 50,000 of their children get vaporized, and you don't have a problem with that? And you start peeling away the psychology of this. It comes down to fear.
Hmm.
It's more than religion. It's literal fear. It's like Hollywood level primordial fear of some kind of the savage hordes that they've been taught their whole life through media, film, Hollywood, television, and extremist preachers on the
Hmm.
Christian side to say that these people basically are heathens, and they need to be eventually eliminated or put into Antarctica or something like that, so they're not going to be a threat to us, and so forth. I mean, the West have their own final solution.
Hmm.
Israel has called this the final solution to the quote Palestinian problem. This is the same language Hitler used against
Correct.
Jews in Europe. So are people not seeing the irony here of
The tables have totally flipped.
the repeat of history, the same patterns? And instead of coming to Jesus and having an epiphany on this, instead everybody's retreating into their kind of ignorant hard shell and saying, let's just blow the fuck out of them and turn it into a glass crater.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the default position for some people because they don't want to deal with the complexity of it, and they don't want to have the self introspection and the self awareness to understand that they're actually being manipulated on such a grand scale by all these narratives that are mostly interwoven lies.
Hmm.
And this is how you get people to go to war. You can't go to war. In fact, you can't. There's never been a genocide in history that wasn't based on a whole pack of fundamental lies at the beginning about another group of people. And you look at Rwanda, we look at all sorts of examples of this. And the fear that comes from those lies is fueling the violent reaction, the revenge. And we
Every
saw
single
that.
time.
We saw that after October 7th with the 40 beheaded babies and the mass rape. And if I say that, I'm called an atrocity denier.
Of
But
course.
I show me the evidence. And these 2 points in particular have been so thoroughly debunked I myself have written extensively on this and researched it, and I have all the sources for it. It's been published in the best-selling magazine, New Dawn magazine. I did a 5,000-word expose back in January, some of which is on 21st Century Wire. But I was just drawing from a lot of the great research done by the Electronic Intifada, the Gray Zone, Israeli press. I pulled my quotes and my data from the Times of Israel, Haaretz, local Israeli media podcast in Israel that documented a lot of witness testimonies to the fact that we found out that there are hundreds of Israelis who were killed by the Israeli IDF on
Yes.
October 7th. And that's a proven fact, admitted in Israel in certain media outlets.
The
but
Hannibal
not-
option was absolutely exercised.
Absolutely, but not allowed to be said by any Israeli politicians, and not allowed to be said by anybody in the United States, not allowed to be said by anybody in Britain or France or the EU, because that's a death sentence politically. If you challenge this, it's become like a religion.
Mhm.
Some people would say, critics of this would say that, whether it's the Holocaust or the Bosnian genocide in the Yugoslavian war, whether it's October 7th, all of these big atrocities develop a kind of institutionalized narrative that you're not allowed to challenge, even if you're not overturning the whole event, but you're maybe querying aspects of it. You will immediately be attacked, politically isolated, and canceled. And worse, you could be jailed.
Which
Uh,
tells you exactly who's in charge.
well, in any case, and myself for challenging the Western narrative on Syria, and basically they say Bashar al-Assad's a brutal butcher. He's a dictator, and I always I wanted to be able to disprove it. So that's why I started researching that, and then looking at the numbers and looking at the methodology and the data collection. I couldn't come to the conclusion that he killed 500,000 Syrians.
Right. He's very
Not,
beloved in his
not,
nation.
well, by a lot of people, by more people than that beloved the last 3 or 4 U.S. presidents. Let's just put it that way.
Sure.
But obviously, he's a wartime president. You see,
Mhm.
and so there's no surprise why he's in power and why he is accepted by the majority of Syrian people. But the point is, there's no evidence that he killed 500,000 of his own people. They're counting Syrian soldiers in the death count of Bashar al-Assad's death count. Syrian soldiers who died fighting al-Nusra. They're counting them in the data. They're counting people that terrorists killed. They're counting dead terrorists. And these are Western funded NGOs like the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights that are basically stand up cutout operations to feed into
Cleverly
this,
named. Yeah.
which is a guy above a fish and chip shop in Coventry, England. That's
Oh,
the
wow.
Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. One guy running Skype calls and getting data fed to him from anti-regime sources. Okay, so that's
Wow.
and that's quoted in the UN, that's quoted in the Guardian, CNN, the BBC. That's their source. So our governments could easily do the data analysis and develop a sound methodology to come to an accurate conclusion of who killed who, but they don't. They're happy with what's being produced by their own proxy cutout.
Well, it's kind of like a series of this throughout history, right? So if you really do research on things, like I literally had somebody, I was talking about Israel, and they're clearly Zionist. Maybe if you're watching the show, which I know she does, maybe you won't be in the future. I'd rather you be an independent thinker than join any side of any discussion. Think for yourself, just like Patrick's been doing for 20 plus years now. But when you look at this, I said, well, let's talk about the Holocaust. She's like, you can't deny that. And I said, well, what's your, sure, like that's your opinion, but how can you say that? And she said, well, have you seen Schindler's List? Have you read Anne Frank's diary? And I retorted back and said, well, Schindler's List won Best Fiction Novel of the Year. Like that's a fact. LA Times nominated Schindler's List as the best fiction novel of the year. I forget which year it was. And of course, there's the debate around Anne Frank diary being written in ballpoint pen, which didn't exist until 1951. So we have all these intertwined narratives that design fear and embed fear in people, which is probably sort of a large scale mass programming that we're all going through, which is always led by fear. You got to be scared of something so you learn to hate it. And you never really learn to love anyone else. one topic we went through with this is most Americans don't know what the word Chaldean means. Like, I have met plenty of Chaldeans. Detroit, Michigan, always thought of as the home of radical Islamism in Michigan, in the country. It's heavily Chaldean. A Chaldean is a Christian from the Middle East. Like, just looking at someone from their skin color, you'd say, oh, they've got to be Islamic. I did it for many years, and it's fascinating to watch how you've gone. I would love to have an off-camera conversation or a drink when you're in America again, because I can see in you the curiosity at a young age moving forward, breaking the paradigm. 99 out of 100 people will never even have that. They will not even look beyond what they were taught, what they were told. And you've actually traveled the world seeing this with your own eyes. And you probably still have the same, the same problems that we have here in, like, being in America. When I explain something overseas that they don't understand, then I hear the Israeli come back. Well, I've been to Israel. It's beautiful. They love us there. Okay, well, that's not what everyone. It is beautiful. It's a beautiful country, but there are certainly problems, just like there are problems here. There are problems in every nation. So how have you gone through this process? Because I'm sure it hasn't been easy. I mean, I imagine the ridicule has been tremendous, having these opposing views from things you've witnessed with your own eyes, living there. How have you gotten through that process of, I disagree with the main narrative. You have a large voice out there. You're known by many people. There are many people in this administration, the last administration, know who you are. How do you get through that? I mean, it's got to be difficult. I'm a small timer here, and I've been through the ringer for challenging COVID's narrative, right? I literally owned a lab, and I said, I have the equipment. I can tell you the pore in the mask is about 300 times the size of a virus. So a Cheerio will go right through a hula hoop. This mask doesn't do any good. But I was ridiculed for that, just for that. I can't even imagine the ridicule you've been through by saying Soleimani isn't who you think he is, neither is Assad. But how has that journey been for you?
First, I just want to backtrack slightly about the Holocaust and Anne Frank's diary. I'm not going to argue those issues.
Yeah, I'm not putting up. I'm just saying that these are things out there.
I'm not going to debate those narratives, because if we had a separate discussion on that, maybe we could look at arguments on both sides of that, and that's probably a better way to litigate that, because that's like red meat to
to a lion. Yeah. No, the whole point was that there's a different perspective. So we have our own perspective here. And then I said, hey, listen, there's many people who will say this, many people who will say that. I actually don't know. And I don't think anyone really knows. But we choose a side. So I agree with you, Patrick. I completely agree.
I think the main point is that what we're trying, I think what you're trying to say, what I'm probably saying here, is that there should be a space for critical debate and discussion for all issues, and nothing should be off limits, because if anything's off limits, then it becomes religious doctrine, basically.
Correct.
And then so we say, oh, we don't want to live in a Taliban society. But if you start, putting guardrails around certain subjects, then that's exactly what you're going to end up getting, is a theocracy, or some kind of an authoritarian society, where there's the list of things that you're not allowed to talk about just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That's the nature of those types of systems. So
Agreed.
So I think we have to do that caveat, because we're all, we will be attacked even for saying that.
Yes.
There should be critical debate around, especially the very anxious and hot topics. Okay, so, but
agreed. Thank you for that. Yeah,
it's very important, because I'm just looking out for the lot of there's attacks and criticism that would come if you go down that road, because what I find is that we're not in an information war. It's if you're doing journalism, it's not an information war. The information's out there. There's no story that I could ever break. There's no such thing as a scoop anymore. Everyone has all the information everywhere, all the time. So the value is in how you tell the story, and how you put together the information and lay it out in a way that people can understand. And so it's not so much an information war. It is kind of at scale, at least the beginning of an event horizon, who gets there first with the propaganda narrative, and then eventually it gets dismantled over time, which is what happened with Syria from 2011. But ultimately, when you're talking about journalism, it's a credibility war. So if you touch any of those third rails, when we say third rails, it's the electrified.
I'm from Chicago. Yeah.
The third.
Don't pee on the third rail.
If
For
you
sure.
touch any of the third rails, your credibility will be attacked. And by attacking your credibility, then they can basically disable and nullify anything that you've said about anything past, present, or future. So,
Correct.
and that's the power of cancellation, and that's based on a prescribed talking points. In politics, you just don't go there. You will be destroyed. You'll be out of politics. So
Mhm.
the problem is in journalism, it's very political as well. So how do you navigate that? So it depends what audiences you want to reach. If you just want to preach to the converted and preach to a small church of conspiracy theorists about a few issues, because that's eventually where you'll be herded by the mob, if the mob wants to silence you on a number of issues. So the only way forward, at least if you want to have intelligent conversations and challenge a number of issues, is that you just have to be really a lot better at sort of how you lay it out objectively and critically. You have to do more research. You really have to know what you're talking about.
Mhm.
That's the real antidote, is knowledge. And I don't have enough knowledge on so many topics that I wish I had more. I have reams and reams of notes of things that I haven't written up, or books. There's a stack of books to my left that would
Yeah, I've
make
got one too.
people's eyes water. I don't think I'll ever get to the bottom of it, but anyway,
Because it keeps growing, right? Mine
yeah,
just keeps growing.
it does. It keeps growing. So, but so do I want to be able to fight a number of battles, or am I going to put all of my chips into one particular subject and die on that hill? And a lot of people have to make that decision. And a lot of podcasters have made that decision depending on what they're into and so forth. And, the extreme end of that is people that have been castigated by the mainstream and Wikipedia as, conspiracy theorists, right-wing extremists, anti-vaxxers,
Mhm. Election
atrocity,
deniers.
election deniers. That's a new one. Atrocity deniers, Holocaust deniers, anti-Semites, and the list goes on and on and on. All of these pejoratives that can just be flung at anybody. There's a huge list of these labels that can be used to discredit. So it's a credibility war at the end of the day. So how do you fortify yourself in the credibility war? You have no protection. There's no protection other than maybe money and clout. Like Elon Musk can do really stupid things on Twitter and then literally be pulled by the ear for a propaganda trip to Israel, which he did.
Yes, he
Ben,
did.
ben Shapiro yanked him, and Rabbi Shmuley pulled the richest man in the world and made him go and do a propaganda tour in
Mhm.
Israel. That's real power. That's real power. So that's the richest guy in the world. And he has to absolutely, he's got guardrails all over the place. You're almost more liberated and more free the lower you are on the pecking order. Obviously, the higher you go up, the less freedom you have to speak your mind.
Makes
And
sense.
talking about woke and anti-woke issues, that's like the kids' table discussion. When you're talking about geopolitics, life and death, war and peace, that's the grown-up conversation. And there's that conversation is much more robust and active and interesting on the sort of mid tier of the independent media than it is in the mainstream and the upper end of the independent media, which I call the mainstream independent media, which is Joe Rogan, Russell Brand, and all of the millionaire podcasters who are all ex-mainstream actors or comedians
Mhm.
who have come down into colonize the independent media. But you don't really hear the interesting conversations there. You do after like 18 months. It's like COVID. Jordan Peterson went into hiding when COVID came and basically didn't comment on it. And this is the guy that every man between the age of 18 and 40 looked up to
Mhm.
for a period of time. The most powerful voice in the internet, and he didn't say a word about lockdowns, and he made his name on lecturing people on authoritarian tyrannical systems.
That's
And
right.
then all of a sudden the tyranny comes to your front door, and Jordan Peterson has run away
Tight
and
lip.
can't even comment publicly on it for fear of losing his book contract or whatever his podcast series was coming out or whatever. He had probably had millions and millions of dollars in income tied up into a lot of these projects, and you could get dropped from your publisher if you're Penguin or Simon and Schuster or whoever. Get this. I know musicians that had their record canceled. We're
Me
talking
too.
the ones that tour stadiums. They had their record canceled. They had their tour canceled. They had their contract canceled. They had their points basically were worthless. They wrote all the songs, and then no points because those songs aren't going to get released and not performed because
Right.
he took a position against the vaccine mandates. So he was punished for that.
Hmm.
So a lot of these top podcasters, the top ones that get millions of views a week, they're giving COVID tests to their guests before they would agree for them to come in the studio. Yeah, I can name
That's
you two.
crazy.
I can name you two of the biggest ones, and I know others were doing it as well. And almost all of them did that. Why? Because that's how Hollywood was operating on film sets.
Mhm.
Hollywood and insurance policies and their agents and all this stuff was all tied into COVID testing and
Mhm.
risk management and risk analysis and all this. So what does that tell you? That tells you that tier of the independent media is exactly the same as Hollywood. It's literally it's like an off Broadway branch of Hollywood, of
Well
mainstream
put.
media. That's all it is.
Well
So
put.
and hence why all these people basically would sort of avoid anything controversial until they can, test the wind. Oh, the crowd's moving. I can talk about this now after 18 months or 2 years and say, oh, I think these vaccines are dangerous, or oh, I think those lockdowns weren't a really good idea, and COVID really wasn't as dangerous as they made it out to be. And they're like, it's 2023 or whatever, and you're like, thanks for that. That's great. You could have actually disrupted the whole damn show if you had, come out and swinging. And aren't you uncancelable, you guys that are getting paid 50 million a year? So I mean, if
Right.
anybody's beyond cancellation, it was these guys, and they were nowhere to be seen. So what does that tell you? That tells you when it comes to serious issues and geopolitics, these people are completely worthless in terms of preventing bad things from happening. They're good at commenting after the fact. So where all the interesting conversations, all the alarms are being pulled on the independent media, people with no money with BitChute channels
Yep.
and Rumble
Yep.
and BitChute and Odyssey and BitChute is where all the COVID truth was.
That's right.
That's where all the COVID truth
The only place you could go.
it was, because YouTube censored the hell out of it. I got kicked off Twitter for a year and a half for challenging the
I
Delta
just got
variant.
suspended from YouTube. I was suspended for 3 weeks up until about 10 days ago. And
Yeah.
I don't get into anything like you guys do. I'm a finance guy. I'm just talking about money most of the time.
Oh yeah, you don't know where the third rail is
No.
with YouTube, but they hit me because I did a video where I was just reading and monologue, and I had a RFK clip in there about how the COVID madness was the challenge of our times, and that was medical misinformation and putting the public at risk. So that was the end of my YouTube channel for a year. So I haven't been able to platform on these, but a lot of people who are in like the geopolitics space literally didn't mention anything COVID related for 2 years.
That's right.
They kept their channels, they kept whatever, and they stayed on Twitter and stuff like that. But some of us who unfortunately comment on multiple issues, not just specialized issues, we paid a very dear price indeed. So we weren't,
Absolutely.
I wasn't able to monetize an income from that or anything. It was just not having the exposure. And I managed to get under the radar with the UK column, which was a great UK independent media outlet. And we did a lot of damage to the COVID narrative until YouTube realized that this boring news program was actually popular, and they shut it down. They deleted all of the affiliate channels too. Very, very malicious by YouTube. And I found out I was on the Twitter files list afterwards. So, and that
Really?
was down to at least on that list. I think I was on another list as well, but the one list that was brought
Oh,
to
I'm
my
sure you're on lots of lists, Patrick. I'm sure that your
but
list of lists is long.
but the Twitter files, though, Matt Taibbi brought this to my attention actually, and it was the Hamilton 68 list. That's U.S. State Department funded. Hamilton 68 by the German Marshall Fund, which is downtown Washington D.C. So I was on a list of Russian disinformation accounts. So like I literally have a history. I have a verified Twitter account. I'm called a Russian bot by the State Department. I'm a verified Twitter user before, blue check, old blue check. I've a blogging history that goes back to 2005. I'm active on Iraq and Libya long before Russia was public enemy number one. And suddenly, because of the election of Donald Trump, the US political system geared up the censorship machine. And all things that were against US foreign policy became Russian disinformation. And any independent voices were immediately put in a certain column, and then hit pieces were written about them. Myself have had a few mainstream hit pieces written about me. I've had mainstream media try to entrap me into interviews, multiple ones. NBC is one, BBC, and luckily I didn't manage to get trapped into those situations, but they're very sneaky about how they did it. But The Guardian did a hit piece and some others, and I got dragged into one of the biggest censorship projects. The first one, actually, I was in the original list that was created by the University of Washington, and one of their departments was mapping disinformation and Russian disinformation on Twitter and so forth. Because of the reporting we did on the white helmets that destroyed this fake NGO that was used as a regime change instrument for the West. Because we exposed that first, we were the first publication to do any extensive work on that in 2015. I became in the crosshairs of some of these big projects, 21st Century Wire, myself. Later, my colleagues, the journalists, also got in on that list and attacked viciously as well for basically ruining one of the greatest propaganda projects ever in history. We really ruined it.
Well,
And we were
I applaud you, and there are many people like me who applaud you. And this has to be a very grueling path to go. Like, I'm not a journalist. I'm a businessman who does a podcast. I mean, I'm a pretty simple guy. But going through your pathway of saying, what were you doing before journalism, by the way?
I was a graphic designer. So my first degree is in art and design. So my previous life I was an artist, graphic designer.
So you had a nice life. You got to create. You were making a living.
Well, nice life, tough life. You know, I
Sure.
worked in a number of industries, as you know, and I was caught between the old design and the new desktop publishing. So
Gotcha.
I wasn't quite advanced enough on, 3D computer graphics or Adobe Premiere animations. I was more skilled in print, logo design, and things like that, typographic design, fine art, illustration. So I kind of fell between the technological procession that happened at the end of the 1980s. But I learned a lot and had great teachers, and it really taught me how to look for things and assemble things and conceptualize things. So that was my first career. I was a sports coach. I coached a National League basketball team in Europe as well. I have good, certifications. Swimming. I was a USS swimming coach in
Oh, wow.
California. So I was a competitive swimmer. NC2A, 4 years, junior Olympian qualifier. So as a high school student at that age, I was pretty good. Masters national finalist. So I had a good athletic career,
Yeah.
and I did coaching, and I did quite well with the swimming coaching. If I would have stayed with it or stayed with the basketball, I probably would still be doing it, but my interest got taken to other things in life, and I
Yeah,
worked in.
that's what I'm saying is like, you go from graphic design, coaching, athlete. I was an athlete too, and a totally different life than we lead now, where you're trying to share truth with people and you're doing it for a living. So like you need to be
Well, trying to make
accessible.
a living,
Sure, sure.
trying to
Well,
make a living.
hopefully this video will help bring some views to you.
Yeah, so that's always a challenge. But I worked in hospitality, I worked in public relations. I think the PR work I did, that's when I really got to see behind the scenes how the communications were working in marketing and
Mm,
PR. And I worked for high tech firms and for big sporting events, fashion, and some of these industries, politics and PR. I was really learning to write and copyright at that time. So I was past a lot of stuff, speech writing. I did a little bit of everything for the companies I was just freelancing with. And I learned a lot about, image projection
mhm.
and how important the release of the press release, the speech release, the statement release, and how to hit that target perfectly. And if you did, you got more work and the company did well. If not, you didn't. So it was literally sink or swim. Very unforgiving business.
Very.
Very unforgiving, like politics, very unforgiving business. But anyway, it was a good education, and it kind of helped me to get into blogging. And in blogging, I really learned about how to develop an audience and communicate with that audience in the comment sections, internet forums, email forums. We had AOL forums in early 2000s. We had chain emails. We had private forums that you had to
Hmm.
register and log on to. We had then the comment sections came, and then responding to emails and just developing and trial and error, and made a lot of mistakes, and I still make mistakes. And I
Sure.
have to correct them as fast as I can. If I make a mistake, try to correct it. But no one's perfect. But it's on the whole, I think I've learned enough about journalism to be able to spot fake news very quickly
Yes.
and propaganda very quickly, to be able to go to the source very quickly to verify whether something is or isn't what it claims, which is very just old school basic research and journalism stuff, basic academia, undergraduate level, really
Hmm.
nothing too advanced. But when you go with mainstream journalism, they don't challenge any of these things. I've worked with mainstream journalists, and they're brilliant. They're much better than me as students. They had a higher GPA, went to better universities, but and they're brilliant writers and great polemicists.
Hmm.
But there's certain assumptions that they don't challenge, and those get baked into their articles. So while they themselves are brilliant, while they themselves are super intelligent, they don't challenge certain sacred cows,
Hmm.
and they build their reality of the mainstream story of the day based on a lot of assumptions that should be challenged. And but because of the institutions they're working for, they can't challenge those assumptions. Like Assad is a dictator and a butcher, for starters, and that there isn't a genocide happening in Gaza, and that all Palestinians are ultimately guilty for not overthrowing Hamas.
Hmm.
Therefore, a lot of these, and they're all basically terrorists, or they're going to grow up to be terrorists, or there's WMDs in Iraq, or the COVID is a deadly
Iran's bad. Everything's Iran's fault. Yeah.
COVID-19 is a deadly pathogen ripping its way around the world in 13 days.
Vaccines work. Yeah.
Vaccines are safe and effective, and the list goes on. So if you don't challenge any of those things, then you might be producing an interesting article or report, but ultimately, if all of these have been debunked
Hmm.
after the fact. So, like, what's the real value of what you've written or what you've been paid to produce? And in many cases, the answer is to reinforce the establishment
Right.
and the big moneyed interests. And so a lot of journalists, unfortunately, are stuck because they have their careers sunk into these jobs once they're married with kids. You
Yeah.
can't just say, "Oh, I'm going to go off the reservation, honey, this week. See how long your wife sticks around."
Mine has for 20 years now, which is fascinating because
That's
I do it
good.
about every 6 years of my life. It seemed to be.
Oh, you do the cycle change. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I gave away everything. I was in California running a public company. I gave away everything, bought a house in Texas, started my life over, and here I am talking to you with
That's
no.
a familiar story. I know a few people who've made that move.
It was just time. God just moves in your life and says, "Listen, things are wrong," and that's why I'm so. This has been such a great conversation. I want to keep it on path though. I've got about 20 minutes left, and I
Okay.
really want to get a breakdown of Syria. But there are times like that's so fascinating to hear your story going, the different avenues you've taken to get to where you are, because I consider you, a freedom fighter. Like freedom fighters don't carry, we're Americans or Europeans. We don't carry rifles. We carry a pen. We carry a phone, and you're taking the stance that most people never would in their entire life. You've been demonetized. You've been censored. You've been deplatformed. You've gone through the ringer. The only thing left is the scary stuff, right? Like that's the only thing that's left. What is it, before we get into Syria, what is it that keeps you going? I know for me, I just, I haven't been as exposed as you are. Like I don't have as large of an audience, but for me, I say controversial things. I challenge the status quo all the time. I always have since I was a kid. And in these days, I've been through the Antifa at your house and death threats on my phone. I've been through all that kind of stuff. And it's always been my faith that got me through it, because I just kind of look at this and say, am I serving God or am I serving man? And if I'm serving man, I'm defying God. And that just kind of keeps me going. What is it that keeps you going?
I think that, I'm very privileged and fortunate to be able to, have published and written and had stuff disseminated and having an impact on the conversation, and then being able to talk to people through podcasts and have my own show, the Sunday Wire, every week for like the last decade, come rain or shine, and a relationship with our listeners and our viewers now on video. And I think, and then once you're doing this for long enough, you know, the game is you wake up, you see what's happening in the world, and you want to put it together and talk about it in a way that makes sense.
Mhm.
So the challenge is figuring it out, being able to communicate it, and trying to bring out the truth of it. And if you're not doing the work to try to figure it out, it's just like if someone hands you, someone, so their engine's not working, there's no mechanic, you got to fix it. So what do? You got to get the manual out. You got to read the damn thing, make a few phone calls to your buddies, and then start having a go. And then eventually trying this, trying that, turn the ignition, and then the thing's firing after a while. And then, at that point, you're on your way to becoming a mechanic. You know how the engine works. But so
Good analogy.
it's the same with media and journalism and geopolitics and politics and stuff like that. You got to get in there and lift up the hood and see what's going on. And so I'm always looking for the mechanisms. And maybe that's what I do is a little bit different than some people, because I can talk about war and conflict and the names and the cities and the weapons and the armed forces and how things are moving and the borders and the agreements and the treaties and all that. But then there's another layer. It's called politics. And ultimately politics, where consensus is decided, public perception, that's that's the real mechanism that's
Hmm.
going to actually drive events one way or the other. In Ukraine, Russia, and NATO, it's politics. That whole conflict,
1,000%. Yeah.
that whole conflict depends on the European political mindset at the moment, and what the European political mindset can withstand or not.
Hmm.
That determines how hard the US and Britain can push in Ukraine.
And boy,
And
are they pushing.
also it determines what the European mindset would either, how they would react if Russia fired a missile to hit a NATO base in Poland. What would the European reaction be? It's a political calculation.
Hmm.
It's a political calculation. And if the answer to that is the Europeans throw their hands up saying, we don't want war, that means NATO Article 5 is null and void. And it ends there.
Hmm.
And then there's a treaty signed. If the appetite is the craziness like pre-World War I, oh, let's go to war. We've got a treaty and we need to follow the treaty and send the boys into the trenches and let's do it. Then you're at war at that point.
Hmm.
And so my job is my challenge is to look at the situation, to look at the people, the government, the military, the history, the context, and try to predict what's likely to happen. What's really, and so if I can do that, if I can make that calculation, then I can kind of guess what the generals are going to be considering, the presidents and the prime ministers, and then I go do my interviews, then I do my talks with sometimes with government people and retired intelligence professionals or whatever, military, active duty, or retired. And if what they say matches up with what I thought before I went to talk to them, then I know I'm on the right track. I know at least I'm on the right track. And then
Sure.
I can then inject my opinion in there and my preferences in there and some nuance. But I have to go through that process without any influence from anybody. So I think you have to do that process yourself, and
Absolutely.
then you start interacting with your contacts and your people and your audience, and then you factor in what you learn from them, and then go out and read more and listen more, and then over time you develop an understanding. You develop a type of a matrix on a topic, and if you do that, if you show up and you do that every day for 10 years, you're going to be pretty good at it.
You get much better at it by the day.
just like a guy who is at the horse tracks every day and who is really has a betting system, and he comes out ahead every month.
Hmm.
He's a is That's called a professional tipster. So he's good at it. He's really good at it. And the reason he's good at it is because he's looking at everything. He's looking at the ground conditions, the weather, the breed of the horse, the pedigree, the jockey, the weight of the jockey, the field, who they're running against, whether it's a fast starter, how tired it is. All of these factors go into play. Plus the odds on the board will determine how much you're going to wager for your prediction. And those guys are professionals, so they've been doing it for like 20 or 30 years. That's why they're good at it.
Hmm.
But they probably didn't start off very good at it. They probably lost a lot.
Oh yeah, they got familiar with the loan sharks early on for
They
sure.
they probably made a lot of bad bets.
That's right.
And the ones that stuck around learned from those mistakes. And the ones that didn't are no longer there.
Hmm.
And so in that sense, the longer you're in the game, the more credibility you have, just by nature of the fact that you're able to navigate through the subject matter a lot more fluidly and a lot easier, and you're able to roll with the punches on how things are breaking and stuff like that. So,
That's a
but
perfect.
being first doesn't there's no glory in it, and there's no reward for it. By the way, I've broken stories and get nothing for it, but the person who broke it the second or third time is the one that would cash in on it.
What's the old
So
saying in business? The pioneers get slaughtered and the settlers get fed.
it's the same in journalism.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same.
It's a perfect segue where we are right now. So the process you go through right now. Let's get into Syria. No one is covering Syria anywhere on the internet with any credibility, which you've mentioned many
Well, a
times.
lot of people. There are people. There are
Yeah,
people.
yeah, yeah.
I can
It's
name off a few. Yeah.
no one or everyone is a hyperbolic statement. No one should ever use. Yeah, very few people are covering Syria because most people don't know. Give us a 5-minute breakdown of what's happening in Syria right now and what you think is going to happen next.
Well, the war that went dormant in 2018 has come to life again, and it's a lot of unresolved problems that were temporarily contained in 2018, i.e., the Al Qaeda terrorist factions, international foreign fighters that poured into Syria to destabilize the country in 2011, 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. They signed a type of a ceasefire in 2018 to send all of the extremists to a province called Idlib that borders Turkey in northwestern Syria. In the meantime, the United States moved in to occupy northeastern Syria by force, and Israel occupies the Golan Heights. And Syria was able to maintain control of the interior of the country and part of its coastline there, where the Russians have a seaport in Tartus and an airbase in Latakia. And it was because of Russia's entrance into the conflict to help Damascus in October 2015 that kept the country from being broken into 4 or 5 different statelets,
Hmm.
and kept the black flag of ISIS from flying over Damascus. A lot of people believe it was the Russian intervention and the Iranians as well, and Hezbollah came and played a huge role in pushing back the terrorist hordes, which the West call the rebels, by the way, which is a complete lie and a misnomer. But anyway,
Yeah,
the
explain
horde,
that. Why is that a lie and a misnomer?
because it's not a civil war if the majority of the fighters are from 100 other countries.
They're nationalists.
Well, they're from Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, the
Uh,
Taliban, Uyghur ISIS fighters from Western China, the 30,000 of those. All in all, 250,000 foreign fighters cycling through there. I mean,
wow.
a lot of countries couldn't withstand that kind of punishment, and Syria survived. Okay, so
250,000.
that's a low estimate. That's a
Wow.
from 2011 until 2018. That's a very low estimate. I was told off for that. I was told by Syrian officials 300, 400,000 in total. And
Wow.
that's different ones cycling in each year
Sure, sure.
over 7-8 year period. And so what happened was, we all know that we're told ISIS was defeated, which for the most part is true. And they didn't get their caliphate, which was supposed to be Mosul and Raqqa, straddling size of Texas, straddling Syria and Iraq. But they did get their Islamic State. This is the lie that we weren't told.
Hmm.
The Islamic State is called Idlib. They just didn't give it the name. And that is an Al-Qaeda occupied province of Syria, stolen from the Syrian people, backed by the United States, Turkey, and paid for by Qatar.
Hmm.
Fact.
Wow.
And Israeli intelligence, US intelligence, British intelligence, French are involved. Turkey is obviously hosting it. And Turkey also occupies the northern border sections of the Syrian territory in order to maintain the Al-Qaeda presence. They're almost like the protectors or the guarantors of Al-Qaeda. So Turkey was supposed to be dealing with the terrorist problem after the ceasefire called the Astana Agreement in 2018. But they used this to buy time to rearm the Al-Qaeda army in the Islamic
Makes
State,
sense.
in the Islam.
Yeah.
It's very familiar, isn't it? Because that's what the Europeans, NATO did with the Minsk Accords. They
Hmm.
sandbagged it for 8 years to build up the Ukrainian neo-Nazi forces and nationalist forces. Isn't it amazing how similar some of these stories end up being?
It's like a
Uh,
cycle that just never ends.
so there's a lot of interesting comparisons there. Same actors involved in some cases. So that facade. So I'm not going to go too hard on Russia for not enforcing that or punishing Turkey, because Turkey lied to the other members of the ceasefire agreement. They lied to Syria, they lied to Iran, they lied to Russia, the guarantors of the Astana agreement. Turkey just gave them a whole song and dance, and Russia was tied down with Ukraine by that time, and that whole issue. Russia's been tied down really with Donbass since 2014.
Yeah.
In real terms, in terms of a crisis point. But so in the Iranians are kind of remote to that location, and there's only so much you can do to twist Turkey's arm. They're one of the most nimble international actors in the whole international system.
Huge military too. Huge,
Huge,
huge arms producer.
and they can play four angles simultaneously on any issue,
Mm.
because that's their geopolitical disposition historically. They're good at that. So it's hard to tie them down and get them to do anything. And ultimately, they're going to act in their own short-term interest. But they have a long-term agenda, which is to reestablish Turkey as a neo-Ottoman power in the region and to lead the Islamic world in the position it once held and
Hmm.
lost to Saudi Arabia, who is the custodian of Mecca and Medina. Turkey and Erdogan's project is called the New Turkey. A lot of people don't know about this, but it's been going for 20 years to transition from a secular republic to an more Islamic republic.
Sure.
And we've chronicled this at 21st Century Wire, and we have the best archive in the world on this topic because of
I'm going to share that across my platforms. Absolutely.
Dr. Jean Arrington. I'll try to drop a few links of some of the articles with you, but nobody has documented it as we have. And it was kind of a long-term investment in that topic, knowing that this would be pivotal. And of course, now it's becoming really important to understand. So Turkey sees Aleppo as part of their
That's
historical.
theirs. Yeah.
Yeah, it's theirs. And if you listen to their speeches in Turkish, they say this to the crowds, but you don't hear it in the Western press, and they won't dare say it in English.
Hmm.
But it is. So luckily, I'm working with a great journalist and a historian that pays attention to these things. And we've been able to chronicle this. Hence, I have some knowledge of this topic, which helped me when I'm having this conversation about Syria, because Turkey is a very important role. They facilitated the destabilization and breakup of Syria. Turkey has. Jordan has played a role. Of course, the United States has played a role. And of
Sure.
course, Israel plays a role, but no one has played a bigger role than Turkey in this project. And they've done it in a very deceptive way. And I think it is one of the biggest disasters. And because they're a NATO member, they've been able to get away with a lot of things.
Sure.
If they weren't a NATO member, this might be a different, because no one can attack them because of
Be an
Article 5.
international crime criminal as well, right?
Yeah, they're protected by NATO, basically. If they weren't a NATO member, none of this would have happened. So while NATO didn't officially illegally invade Syria, while NATO didn't officially host the largest terrorist army in the history of the world, and NATO didn't officially destroy a country's whole manufacturing sector, which Turkey did too. By unleashing ISIS and these fighters via Turkey, they destroyed the Aleppo manufacturing corridor. It would be like torching the Silicon Valley in the United States, and see what that does to the American economy.
Right.
It would damage the American economy if the entire Silicon Valley was torched in a month. And that's what happened to a smaller degree in Syria with ISIS, Nusra, and the quote Free Syrian Army, who are all one and the same, by the way.
Hmm.
They ran roughshod and they dismantled all the factories in Aleppo, put it on large truck articulated lorries, and shipped all the machinery to Turkey, stole the whole manufacturing sector. And
Wow.
Turkey's never paid reparations for that. What if Turkey had to pay reparations for what they've done to Syria, the country would be bankrupt, like Germany was after World War One.
Treaty of Versailles, yeah, devastating.
Interesting. Yeah, there should be a Treaty of Versailles to try to reconcile some of the stuff that's been done to Syria. So anyway, we're back to square one again. The terrorists have been unleashed. The dogs have been let out of the cages, and they're running roughshod. And they've taken Aleppo, the second largest city, in a week, and they've taken Hama, one of the fourth largest city, I believe, in Syria, in a matter of 2 or 3 days. And things are looking really bad right now for Syria. They're in a worse position now, I'll argue, than they were in 2015. So if something doesn't happen to turn the tide radically on this, you could be looking at a real ugly 2 or 3 years of fighting, and cities being leveled. Historic cities that are part of the World Heritage will be leveled. And
It's been a common theme in the last 20 years out there.
So, that's what I say to Americans and Europeans. Do you really want to see our collective heritage? Because that's how people in Syria see it. It's not Syrian heritage. They're very proud. They say, come and visit our country and we'll show you our human history. That's the way they frame it. And we don't even look at it that way. We're quite happy to allow ISIS and Al Qaeda, if they're overthrowing the governments we don't like, to basically destroy the oldest temples in the ancient city of Palmyra, 5,000 years old, which they did. And I witnessed that personally.
And same in Mosul, Palestine, Lebanon. You're talking about 1,500, 1,800, 2,000, 5,000-year-old artifacts that are truly the basis of most religions.
Yep.
I would love to have seen some of these churches, but I'll never be able to see them.
Yeah, and some of the most beautiful, simple, austere churches, old Orthodox Christian churches in Palestine, Lebanon. There's a real vibe when you walk into these places, and
I'm sure
to see those being destroyed, and there's zero outcry in the West, to me, is one of the most shameful things. But I mean, it shouldn't be for the church; it should be for the people and for the children. Who among any Christian in any community can look at the amount of killing and suffering done on such a mechanistic way and call them and say that this is somehow justified? How does that comport with the teachings of Jesus Christ? I can't.
It doesn't.
I cannot see it. I cannot see it. We were the New Testament is about turning the other cheek. It's not an eye for an eye. But with Israel,
he did flip over money tables and whip some people too.
He did. But,
we forget that part of Jesus.
Israel's doctrine is 1,000 eyes for an eye.
Yes.
1,000 eyes for an eye. But
the whole family, not the target. That's right.
You're right. As Gerald Celente said, the Prince of Peace overthrew the money changers, got angry at the money changers, the bankers, overthrew the money tables in the temple. That was the cover of Trends Journal, I think, in 2012 or something like that.
Well, I'm going to give you a piece of scripture that next time you're in the States, I'm going to get you a Bible, whether you're a believer or not. I'm going to get you a Bible. I'm going to inscribe this on the front on a leather Bible for you, because you are following my favorite piece of scripture that most people forget from Ephesians, chapter 5, verse 11. Do not partake in the fruitless deeds of darkness, but expose them. And that is a piece of scripture that you are living by. So what do you see happening here in the next, you said next 2 to 3 years, if what's happening right now doesn't stop? We're going to see a serious war in Syria. What does that mean for the rest of the world?
Yeah, well, to take another Bible quote here, which is an article which I'm writing. I don't normally quote scripture, but this is from Matthew 24:6-13, King James Version. And ye shall hear wars and rumors of wars. See that ye not be troubled, for all that these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For a nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines, pestilence, earthquakes in divers places. So that's kind of where we're at now. Everybody has a lot of anxiety that we're on the precipice of a world war or a nuclear conflagration, and with good reason on a number of fronts. So, what happens? We've been here before during the Cold War. This is a little more chaotic, I think. This is multiple fronts: Middle East, Russia, China as well.
Mhm.
That will come with the Trump administration. This great confrontation against China, again, contrived, unnecessary, but we're having to process all this stuff. So yeah, how do we keep our heads during these crazy times, and how do we keep ourselves from being overcome with anxiety or getting hysterical and then end up forming a cheerleading section for
Right.
World War III? That's the place you
Right.
don't want to be. And so yeah, it's a good discussion. This is a legit discussion. And as we have so many of these politicians injecting religion into politics, like Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, injecting evangelical narratives
Oh, yeah.
into politics, foreign policy, then let's continue having that conversation. That are what you guys doing here, advancing a path to World War III, or are you moving us towards peace, or do you want a war of annihilation
Mhm.
because you believe you're going to be victorious, and therefore that's going to be peaceful for us because we're the victors, and that doesn't matter if we kill 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 million people in the process.
It's a
That's okay.
dangerous road.
That's okay. So this is the real conversation that we're going to end up having anyway. So why don't we just have it ahead of time instead? But this is what politicians and people in power don't like to do. Oh, no, no, we can't talk about that now. It's too early.
Yeah,
It's
wait
too,
wait till it's over, we'll discuss what happened. We'll
yeah,
play Sports Center, right?
no, yeah, we'll tell you what to think after we've done it.
Right.
Basically. And so that's what we have to do. We have to have that conversation. We got to talk this out. And by us talking it out and all these different platforms, then that percolates up to the top, and all of a sudden we've decided the consensus
That's
before.
right.
And so then they have to react to what we're saying and what we're believing and thinking, because we've already digested this argument and taken it even further than it's being taken in the mainstream. So I'm sure there's things behind the scenes and there's plans afoot. I'm
Sure.
sure we don't have access to those classified briefings, and there's plans, lots of plans. But as
Sure.
Robert Burns, the famous Scottish poet, said, the best laid plans of mice and men and don't always come to fruition. So that's also a parable and a lesson to learn as well. And there's plenty of examples of the best laid plans of mice and men that never came to fruition. There's whole books written about those.
That's right.
So
It goes back to the old saying of man plans and God laughs, right?
yeah,
There's also certain things that fall outside the purview of human decision making, and I'm a believer in that. Patrick, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on here. I've got to wrap it up here in just a minute. A couple things. Number one, let everybody know where they can find you. 21st Century Wire, that's .com. On Twitter. Give us all your handles. How can we find you? We're going to include them in the video as well, so that everyone can find you and follow this information.
yeah. So yeah, our biggest social media platform is probably Twitter, X, Twitter. So it's at 21wire. Real simple. That's my main account. We have a separate account as well, 21st Century Wire, smaller account. We are on YouTube, 21st Century Wire TV. There's a few.
Every Sunday night, live every Sunday night.
We're doing Sunday Wire. Plus, I'm putting out a lot of shorts as well on YouTube Shorts that aren't getting censored, which is great. And we're on the other platforms too, Rumble and so forth, and 21st Century Wire. Definitely, I do Twitter Spaces live. I host or I'm speaking on panels there. Did one last night on Syria, which was great, and 2 or 3 hour discussions. Doing Q&As and stuff. So that's a good tool that I try to participate in sometimes. And
Share those out for you too. Those are very important to have the Q&A opportunity for somebody to have the chance to ask questions of someone like you, who's not only researching this, but has been there, I think is
Yeah.
crucial.
And I'm often sharing the stage with some top, you know, ex people, academics, people, generals,
Hmm.
retired generals and stuff. So, it's a great learning experience for me to be able to share the stage with some of these people. So I try to put myself in those positions as much as possible so I can, get some wisdom and some knowledge. And I had a great lecture last night by a Harvard lawyer on Ottoman and the Middle Eastern caste system and how that feeds into the instability of Syria now and the discontent of the ruling family, the Assad family, and so forth. And he was on the other side of the issue politically as me, but we managed to have a discussion.
Those are the best discussions. Those are the people always tell me, go to truth, go on truth. I'm like, I don't want to go to truth. I
No,
don't
it's
want to
just,
be in an echo chamber. I want to be where people disagree. I mean, that's where
yeah.
you make impact.
That's also where you sharpen up your arguments a
That's
lot.
right.
So, and I learned the most going into hostile environments.
Hmm.
And you just have to try to maintain your composure and your cool because that can get quite heated.
They can keep trying. I'm pretty good at that.
You're, you're talking about life and death, and you might take it seriously. Someone might have a different attitude towards it. They might be spewing lies and propaganda. You're trying to debunk them in real time, and then there's names get called, and sometimes things get ugly. But I put myself in those positions enough, I think, and it's helped to sharpen my arguments to what so I can make arguments that can actually stand on their own 2 feet, which sometimes you can't always do that. Like
That's right.
you think you have knowledge of a subject, which I have sometimes thought I had knowledge of the subject, but my knowledge was very, very limited. And it wasn't until I got into, the shark's tank with all the people who really had knowledge of it. I might have knowledge of certain things, but they have definitely deep knowledge. And then that those are always the times. And this could happen in informal discussions, not just on Twitter spaces or podcasts, but like out in
Most commonly.
the
Yeah.
world so that's why it's good to go, even if you're not a journalist, just to go to visit a certain place and go to attend some events, meet some people. I do this in Washington DC all the time. Like I don't want to live in Washington DC, but I need to be there a couple times a year if I
Sure.
can, and I need to go attend talks, debates, and meet political people for informal discussions while I'm there, and do podcasts.
Mm.
So that's then I get in touch with Washington policy world, and because I need to know that, because that's the realistic hard end of that policy discussion. Like what's really going to happen. I
Sure.
we all have our idea of what we want to happen, but what's really going to happen. So you gotta plug into that. Just like you gotta go to the Middle East to plug in to what's going on there sometimes, or go to Russia and go to Moscow and plug in there. And I've been able to do that in some of these places recently in Hungary,
Next
which
year will be my first time. I'm going to Moscow next year for an
oh,
event. Yeah. Can't
fantastic.
wait.
Yeah, it's a great city. It is really phenomenal. But what's really amazing in Moscow and these forbidden locations like Tehran in Iran or Moscow or Belarus or whatever is when you meet up with the real, you know, hardcore political minds and political junkies that can talk politics all night, and then you're really getting a master class from people and on history, politics, bureaucracies, and things like that. Stuff that you would never understand unless you were physically there.
Sure.
Brussels, go to Brussels. If you want to know about the EU, you got to go to Brussels. Got to go to the Brussels. You got to get into the European Parliament. You got to sit in the gallery. You got to meet people. You got to read the periodicals that are on offer. Same with Britain in the Parliament and the House of Commons and so forth. And this is the only way you can really understand how these political bodies work. As much as we loathe and are disappointed by them so much, we still need to understand how they work, because stuff will get decided in those institutions. So the more plugged in we are there, great. And then the same with any other area of activity or
Seeking
expertise.
knowledge wherever you
Yeah.
can.
J6, another example. People demonize all the J6ers, but none of them, the people who are demonizing them, have never met and talked to any of
Oh, I know
them.
dozens. Yeah. I know
So,
dozens.
and then when you start hearing their horror stories of what they've been through since J6 in terms of persecution by the FBI, imprisoned, having their lives ruined,
Half of them are bankrupt.
all that
Yeah.
debanked, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Then it's a different discussion. They're not just, rabble rousers at that point. They're literal political dissidents in the United States of America. Now that's a different conversation.
Hmm.
That's a different conversation. And so they have a lot in common with the victims of the Red Scare in the 1950s, or the first Red Scare in the 1930s, I think. And the when J. Edgar Hoover tried to infiltrate the anti-war movement, and they have all these different times in America where you've had dissidents that have been, targeted, persecuted, marginalized for different reasons. And J6 is just another example of that.
Yes, it is.
It might not be a glamorous civil rights Martin Luther King style story of the 1960s, or the Vietnam anti-Vietnam hippies.
All right.
And we watch all these documentaries, everyone dropping acid, and it was like Summer of Love and a glorious time in American culture. It may not have all of those attributes to it, but is it just as much legitimate dissidents as any other time in political history in the United States. But you can only understand them and their plight if you can talk to them and hear their
Yes.
story. So this is another thing. People need to get engaged with the real world more, rather than just being content with what we're picking up online. So
That's right.
that's not just if you're a journalist. I think to some degree everybody who has a social media account is doing a level of journalism at different levels. So it is a level of journalism. So obviously the more knowledge and experience you have that you can bring to the table in the conversation, the better the conversation is going to be.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, Patrick. I can't thank you enough. This is our first time on here. I'd love to have you back on in a few months. Just catch up, get some information from out there. I know you're always seeking. Thank you so much for being on here. I hope all of you have enjoyed this. This is a breadbasket of knowledge that you just don't get anywhere else. And when I'm online, I'll be following you here. I'm going to be posting all the ways to follow you online. Make sure everyone's paying attention to what you're saying. As I say with everyone, listen to everything, discern the truth. Listen to everything. I've found a ton of people online that they'll sprinkle in something every now and then that have great information. Unfortunately, you're not one of those people. Just about everything you're putting out there, I track and I kind of follow, if not agree with. But today was enlightening. Did not know much about Syria. I don't think many people even, I would bet 99 out of 100 Americans couldn't find Syria on a map and don't realize how important it is in the midst of a potential nuclear event in the region. So, Patrick, thank you so much, man. This was great. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, Eric.
And we will see you next time, everybody. Until next time, I'm Eric Rice. This is the Rice Report interview series. God bless you. God bless this country. And we'll see you next time. Have a good one, everybody.